Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the relevant standing orders of the House be suspended. I have to say it again.
Now, the bill has already been read a first time, so we move to the second stage of the bill now.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the relevant standing order of the House be suspended to enable the bill to be taken through all its stages at this sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, I think what you need, Honourable Parliamentary Representative, what you need is to move to the second stage, because the first stage is already completed. So we're not taking it through all its stages at this sitting, we're taking it through the remaining stages at this sitting.
Okay.
So move to the second stage.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of the bill.
Honourable members, the question proposes that the Praedial Larceny Amendment Act 2020 be read a second time. Honourable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to amend the Praedial Larceny Act, Cap 250, to make provision for the classification of soursop as a specially protected produce, create a licensing regime under the Act, establish a Praedial Larceny Management Unit, make provision for the appointment or delegation of a Praedial Larceny Management Committee, mitigate the adverse effects of Praedial larceny on food security generally, and apply stiffer penalties, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, soursop, referred to as our green gold in Grenada, Grenada is the only country, Mr. Speaker, that is supplying fresh soursop to the international market. Mr. Speaker, according to our records, we have seen an increase from 51,374 pounds of soursop exported in 2018 to 92,738 pounds in 2019. Mr. Speaker, I recall, even during the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, the demand and export continued, bringing well-needed revenue to the farmers and foreign exchange to this country. Mr. Speaker, for that reason, this market ought to be protected and sustained, and the producers, our hard-working farmers, need to be protected from Praedial larceny. Mr. Speaker, I have seen and felt the plight of our farmers. I was personally told hundreds of stories by farmers. Farmers sleeping in the fields at night. Farmers running down thieves, damaging, Mr. Speaker, themselves to protect their produce. Farmers putting needles in produce with the hope of holding the thief. Frequently seen, Mr. Speaker, and that's new, are vehicles driving around with rods picking soursops, unknown to the farmers, the owners. We have heard this concern, Mr. Speaker, and this is the move to manage such activities in this fast-growing industry through a mandatory licensing regime of 3 categories: traders, carriers, and travelers' license. Mr. Speaker, farmers are fed up. They are working hard, and in some cases are stealing from farmers, and other persons who do not have a scrap of land, reaping, Mr. Speaker, the hard labor of farmers, of others. Mr. Speaker, some farmers have spent a lot of money. They have invested in cameras. Some have fenced their entire property. I mean, that level of investment And the persons out there are still stealing. A farmer was crying to me, I went to visit him. And he said he bought a dark vehicle. You heard that? He had to buy a dark vehicle. Because he said he tired sitting on a stone in his land. He eventually bought an old pickup. And he sits in that pickup every night. He has a family. But he sits in that pickup every night watching his field. I mean, come on. What is happening here? He doesn't have a life. So he toils every day in the field. And then when he has to get a good night rest, he has to be back out there sitting, cramped in a vehicle, looking at his field. Mr. Speaker, that is craziness, and we can't continue with this. Mr. Speaker, farmers are crying out and looking to the government to provide answers, to provide protection. Mr. Speaker, that is the purpose of our being here today, to make those critical changes to this Praedial Larceny Act. The time for stealing and damaging to property has to stop. Our markets must be protected according to law. Effective management must be practiced, and benefits must be enjoyed by all. Mr. Speaker, this bill contains 13 clauses. And I will go through parts of it, Mr. Speaker, and when the committee form, I would explain more about the changes in that form. But based on how I designed my presentation, some of the information will be shared on both ends. Mr. Speaker, Clause 1 provides for the short title. Clause 2 provides for the amendment to Section 2 of the Principal Act to insert definitions. So you'll see different definitions included there in that clause, Mr. Speaker, based on the changes that were made. Clause 3, Mr. Speaker, provides for the insertion of new sections 2A to 2M to the Principal Act. Section 2A provides for the establishment of the Praedial Larceny Management Unit, Mr. Speaker. And Section 2B provides for its functions. Section 2C provides for the establishment of the Praedial Larceny Management Committee. And Mr. Speaker, we already have that unit at the Ministry of Agriculture. However, there is need for enactment to concretize the functions of that unit. So the unit is there, but it's not functioning, it is not, functioning as it should. It's not enacted in the whole thing. So we are happy that we are moving in that direction, Mr. Speaker, hopefully. Section 2D, Mr. Speaker, to 2M creates a licensing regime under the Act to facilitate the trade of business by buying, selling, exporting, conveying, or otherwise dealing in specially protected produce of the weight of 15 pounds or more. You must have a license granted by the minister. Failure to comply, Mr. Speaker, a fine of not less than $5,000 and not more than $10,000 and imprisonment for 4 years. Mr. Speaker, this section is proposed to enable management, monitoring, and effective predial investigations into uncontrolled picking, carrying, and exporting of soursop. Mr. Speaker, Section 2E to the Principal Act, types of licenses. We have 3 categories there, Mr. Speaker. We have the traveler's license, the trader's license, and the carrier's license. Mr. Speaker, in Section 2G to Section 2N to the Principal Act speaks of process of application and determination of license. It also speaks of where licenses has to be cancelled or revoked and the fines and penalties to address the situation. Mr. Speaker, Clause 4 provides for the amendment of Section 5 of the Principal Act to increase the penalty for the offense of damage to produce. This act, Mr. Speaker, is amended by inserting these words, a term of, immediately before the word imprisonment, and by deleting the word for 24 months and substituting the word not exceeding 5 years. This allows the magistrate flexibility. Mr. Speaker, I would not go through all, but Clause 5, some pertinent areas I want to highlight. Clause 5 provides for amendment to Section 6 of the Principal Act to increase the penalty for the offense of dishonesty, receiving Praedial Larceny, Praedial produce, to a fine exceeding $10,000 and a term of imprisonment not exceeding 5 years. Before, Mr. Speaker, the Principal Act did not speak to convictions and penalties, nor did it seek to identify distinctions of dishonesty, receiving, having unlawful possession, and dishonesty receiving with the intent to export. So that was straight. Mr. Speaker, Clause 6 provides for the amendment to Section 8 of the Principal Act to increase the penalty for the offense of vagrancy, persons who just go on your farm and find themselves there without any consent, reflecting imprisonment not less than 2 years and not exceeding 5 years. So the magistrates now have, Mr. Speaker, the discretion of increased sentencing for this offense. Clause 7, Mr. Speaker, provides for the insertion of new Section 10A and 10C to the Praedial Act, which provide for the forfeiture and sale of any agricultural produce or vehicle or other conveyance seized in relation to an offense after conviction, restitution, and the sale or disposal of and compensation of perishable agricultural produce. So that clause, Mr. Speaker, explains all those different areas, what happens with the goods when they have been collected, how it's been disposed, etc. Clause 8, Mr. Speaker, provides for amendment to Section 12A of the Principal Act to empower the minister to issue an identification card in addition to the certificate of registration. Mr. Speaker, this allows for the farmer's ID to be legally recognized. Mr. Speaker, we have an effective card ID system at the ministry, but that was never enacted. Clause 9, Mr. Speaker, provides for the amendment to Section 12B of the Principal Act to increase the penalty for failing to comply with the provisions relating to the memorandum of sale of delivery. So a person who fails to comply commits an offense and is liable to a fine not less than $5,000 and not more than $10,000, and to a term of imprisonment for a minimum of 4 years. Mr. Speaker, this section of the Principal Act reflected a minimum of 2 years for failing to have a receipt. So it has been increased to 4 years. Clause 10, Mr. Speaker, provides for amendment to Section 12C of the Principal Act to extend the powers granted thereunder to a rural constable or other persons designated in writing by the minister. Whereas the Principal Act only reflected a police officer, this empowers the minister to recommend increased manpower. Mr. Speaker, most Praedial Larceny cases are attended to by rural constables, which is now reflected in the proposed bill. Mr. Speaker, and maybe at this point in time I could give you an insight a little bit regarding manpower and the importance of manpower in this whole Praedial Larceny plan and program going forward. Mr. Speaker, since 2004, 35 officers were trained as a task force. They were subsequently moved to various departments within the Royal Grenada Police Force. Coming from the 35 trained persons, there were only 7 officers remaining. Other civilians were later grafted in to give support to the department. Mr. Speaker, at present there are 29 persons within the task force, and this is by no means capable of responding to over 7,000 farmers out there. Mr. Speaker, the department will need a minimum of 50 persons attached to the 12 police stations at the various divisions and districts if we are to really follow and to curb this Praedial Larceny as we are passing this legislation and we are proposing this legislation. We have to put these structures in place and the quality of people in place so that we can address this issue. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to raise that because I think that was very important at this point in time to let the Honorable House and the persons out there know that moving in this direction, we also have to have a good plan and structure to make sure that this whole change is taking place. So, Mr. Speaker, clauses 11 and 12 are provide insertions to new 11 to Section 18A to the Principal Act to empower the Minister to amend the schedules. So, Mr. Speaker, with these few words and this level of explanation here this morning, Mr. Speaker, I hope that we have a better understanding and the seriousness of this piece of legislation that we are moving to pass in this Honorable House. I know the farmers will be happy. I know the thieves will not be happy. And I'm hoping that, Mr. Speaker, that we would all take this move seriously and we should support that level of amendment to this bill, Mr. Speaker.